Now we're in the phase of living with COVID, often erroneously referred to as post-COVID. We can start to reflect on how many of the changes we've experienced over the past 2 years are likely to be permanent. Like the population shift to the regions, will working from home continue to be the norm, or will the pendulum swing? In either scenario, have we seen a structural shift in the requirements for housing in this country? And what about immigration? Will we resume pre-COVID levels? And if so, where will these people live? How far behind are our policymakers in anticipating future housing demand and supply?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free Fool or Forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
We're joined today by demographer Simon Kuestenmacher, who we've had on the podcast before, and each time we've enjoyed his data-driven perspective on demographic, consumer and social trends. Simon is the co-founder with Bernard Salt of the I'm really fucking up with the demographics group at the moment.
It's our second one today, Simon. Sorry.
I know my mouth's gone all fat. Simon is the co-founder with Bernard Salt of the demographics group, and we're delighted he's joined us again today to talk about the future and how it's shaping up for housing in this country. Welcome back, Simon. It's always good to see you.
It's great to be back.
Simon, always love our chats, mate. I mean, it's 2022. I think we chatted back in 2020 was our last time, and maybe even a couple of years before that was the first time. I mean, in 2022, what's going through your brain, right? So what's your sort of big sort of themes? What's some I guess global trends that are popping up and things that you're investigating? You know, what's going on in Simon's brain at the moment?
The big thing that's going on here is that I'm constantly finding myself reading up on geopolitics, on global trade issues, because everything that we care about in Australia, of course, does not happen in a vacuum. This happens in the context of broad international trends and the roll down of global free trade. You know, we're rolling this back. There will not be as easily delivered goods to Australia. It means just essentially everything that we import into the country will become more expensive. And remember that we largely import high-tech goods, all our cars, our machineries, even if you talk about things that are being built in Australia, that are manufactured in Australia, all the equipment, all the machinery that we use in the manufacturing process come from overseas. So we heavily rely on free trade. But that said, we're rolling this back internationally speaking. So everything that you put into your business will become more expensive in the next couple of years. So I'm doing the rounds on the speaking circuit, in the consulting circuit, to telling businesses to prepare for the rising costs.
So do you think this is a fallout of the Brexit, a fallout of Trump? Do you think it's just, the years down the line, then you've got the things with Russia, obviously, and the COVID and supply chain issues. But do you think these trends started years ago if you sort of worked your way all the way back?
Absolutely. That started years and years ago. So the Americans, who of course are a big military power and who guarantee global free trade by keeping the oceans safe and by being a military presence wherever you look, they essentially allowed us to do this free trade. They increasingly have no appetite anymore to be the global policeman. So they roll that back. That means you have more regionalized power. That means global free trade slows down a bit. That happened under Trump. That happens under Biden. There is no change there, and America will not change their mind. Period. So we're moving into this, and on top of this, you have a war in Ukraine, which really makes, it's another slowdown of this. On top of this, there's COVID, which means the ports in China that we heavily rely on for our imports, they are closed or they operate under certain limitations. So things are not going well from an import perspective for Australia at the moment.
Well, we've obviously set ourselves up for this too, in the sense that we have closed down a lot of our manufacturing over the last few decades. So, I guess, was there nobody paying attention to any headwinds here?
I would say we are actually really, really lucky that we closed car manufacturing a couple of years before COVID hit, for example. Imagine if we had still a vibrant car industry in Australia. They couldn't have possibly operated because most of the machinery, most of the parts of the cars were not produced in Australia to begin with. They were imported. So we would have dropped out of those.
But I thought we actually had quite a lot of componentry manufacturing in Australia, and they were the sort of the knock-on industries that all were affected when we shut down the plant.
Exactly, but that's what that's the beauty or the terror of the global free trade system, is that you can produce 95% of whatever in the country, and if there is a slowdown of just one small part of the whole process, the system cracks. So we were actually preparing ourselves, again, dumb luck, we didn't do anything to deserve it, for this eventuality by closing the manufacturing sector beforehand.
Oh, so that was a good thing.
Do you think it's a bit wishful thinking, Simon, that there's obviously an inflation outbreak around the world, that these supply chain issues are just all temporary, and, imports are going to get cheaper, and inflation's going to get under control very quickly once we sort of get over this COVID world, and maybe this Russia war sort of sorts itself out. I don't know, but you know what I mean? Do you think that's wishful thinking? Do you think we are going to see trade get really tougher? Imports are going to get more expensive, and this is going to be a real problem over the next decade.
I'm of two minds, because I'm reading both perspectives. I'm reading the pro-globalist perspective. That's the World Economic Forum perspective of what can we do in order to continue trade as much as possible. And I do see that there's a lot of appetite there. I do see that the population around the world increasingly thinks in a globalized way, that the individual humans see borders as less of an issue. So that's what makes me positive about, continuing this trade. But then I'm also reading all the big major geopolitical thinkers, and they put me into a bit more cautious mindset, because I'm, for example, one of the people who does not think that China will be a major superpower. I think China stands in front of a demographic and economic collapse in the next decade or two, which then, drives the biggest demand market that we have down. So that's a problem. So I don't think that we can just bet on continuation of pre-COVID free trade in a couple of years. I wouldn't think so.
What about our desirability for moving to Australia, and the education coming back and things like that? What are your sort of thoughts around? Have you shifted to thinking it's going to be more than what we had prior to COVID? Do you think Australia's got out of COVID and has got a good reputation? Do you think we actually managed that well? I mean, what's your thoughts on 2022?
First and foremost, I must say that I think the world will view Australia in a very positive way, how we manage COVID, because the world will only look at two major figures. They will look at the death rate per million residents, and we are doing extremely well with this measure. I think by now you were around 50 times more likely to die of COVID in Europe than in Australia. So that's a huge success. US is even worse. So that's wonderful. Then you will look at the vaccination rate as an indicator of how prepared and willing a country will be to face a potential new pandemic. And we are also doing extremely well in this measure. So from that perspective, people will just say Australia is a wonderful place. Then who is coming to Australia? Well, big chunk of them, of the migrants, are international students. They will want to continue to come because the appetite for an English-speaking, high-quality education remains. Even if China is slowing down economically, we will still see the increasing size of the middle class for another 2 decades or so in China. So that means the new middle class will want to invest into their kids' future. They will send them overseas to study. Why not go to Australia? Australia is currently hurting itself a bit by not handing out a clear pathway to citizenship. It's very complicated. It's unsure what you need to do and whether you will be able to get a citizenship once you invest into Australia. That leads some international students to choose Canada over us, simply because Canada has a clearly demarcated pathway. And that's something that we need. I'm not saying we need to take everyone, but I'm saying we need to make it very clear and obvious. You need to have this level of language skills, this qualification, blah, blah, blah. And then you get citizenship within that time frame. That will ensure us to win the brain drain, because we need to remember that we might at the moment still think a bit critically about migration. There might be too many. The world will not think this way very soon. The world will start shrinking within 30 years. That means that all of a sudden, the whole world will be like Japan. Aging, shrinking workforces, so there will be a global competition for talent. We're seeing this now with a skills shortage in Australia, that this is already beginning, that the narrative about migration all of a sudden is very positive. It was much more negative in the past, and I'm saying this as somebody who writes columns that use words like migration a lot, and so I get comments in the online media that tell me what people think.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So, do you think that we've handled COVID well, but we didn't really treat our foreign guests, I guess, very well, and we. I think that we did lockdown more than anyway. I mean, you're living in Melbourne, so you experienced that, etc. So do you think that those things were short term? People have forgotten about those, and they're just going to focus on those two simple things: the death rate and vaccination rate. And Australia's still a beautiful country to live, and it's still got great universities. So let's send our kids that way. Encourage our kids to go to Australia.
Exactly. And really, the whole brand that Melbourne in particular had for a short period of time of being the world's longest, the world's worst lockdown or whatever, that's way past now, because Shanghai, they well overtook us here in Melbourne. So the global awareness isn't all that much. You can only say one place that was bad. And now everything that wasn't as bad as Shanghai will look fairly good in the global comparison. Plus, I don't think it will measure too much in the decision-making of people when they move here.
And so do you think that, you then mentioned that do you think the government is going to change the narrative and then go all in on migration? Because if you think that's really our ticket, right? I mean, if the world's shrinking, no point trying to solve that problem in 30 years' time when there's a global competition for talent. Maybe we should be getting ahead now while we've still got that desirability.
Absolutely. It is of paramount importance. If you want to position Australia for the next 50, for the next 100 years, you need to become a country that is considered to be the envy of the world. You want to make sure that particularly the globally mobile workforce wants to go to Australia. They can choose wherever they want to live. And why do you come to a place? Because it is safe. Physical safety, safety of property, a democracy. These are all really good things. Then you have a bit of nice weather, nice climate, a nice lifestyle, and an affordable lifestyle, so that you earn good money, and it's all well and good. We're currently risking making housing so unaffordable that other places win out. Good news is that Canada, probably the biggest competition, and New Zealand, biggest competition in those lifestyle countries, they are terribly expensive as well. So this disadvantage isn't as dramatic as it should be.
Isn't that a byproduct then of being a lifestyle country?
The house prices, I don't think so. I wrote a couple of columns about this, that the major issue of high house prices here is supply. We could easily drive house prices down if we doubled and tripled down on adding more housing supply. And we're not doing this. The supply that we add year on year is a bit small.
Do you think
this is all...
You go.
Well, this is quite interesting, because the thing is that, yes, you could drive pricing down. We don't want to drive prices down, really, do we? Because more people own property than don't own property, and I don't want values to plummet through the floor, absolutely, and I don't think anyone else who does own a property does. But making it accessible, because affordability isn't just about people buying property; it's also about people being able to access basically a secure roof over their heads. So you've got low-income people that are struggling to find accommodation. We've got a massive problem in regional areas. We've been hearing so many stories about displacement of established communities and established, residents of regional areas. So the supply side has to be even if the governments did tackle supply, they've got to build it where it is needed.
Yeah.
Not lots and lots of more 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in Brisbane City or in Melbourne City or Sydney City even, and so I don't know if this is outside your lane or not, but I mean, what is the problem there? Why are we encouraging developers, and why are they, in fact, building stock in places where supposedly people don't want to live? It doesn't actually make sense.
Lots in this question. So the first answer here is we need housing stock where it's needed. So we need to think about where will people live. And there's the short-term question of settlements patterns changed during COVID. We've seen all of a sudden what was used to be the fastest growing areas, the inner cities, emptying out, losing population. Not much happened in the middle suburbs. They lost a bit of population. And then the outer suburbs, the urban fringe grew, and regional Australia all of a sudden was the fastest growth area in the country. Bizarre if you compare it to the previous years, but quite logical if you think about it. The population that we lost in the inner city and in the middle suburbs, the first group were temporary residents. These were international students, skilled migrants that were renting. So their visas ran out. They decided, if my uni is locked down, why stay here? Why not go home to wherever my parents live? So that's happened. That made us lose people in the inner city. Also, the young people of all of Australia that would have usually moved to the inner city of Melbourne, they didn't come for 2 years because the city was locked down. So that's the COVID-related changes. On top of this, you had an even bigger factor in play. That is that the biggest generation in Australia, the Millennials, just by sheer demographic dumb luck, happened to go into the family formation stage of the life cycle as the pandemic hit. So that means the Millennials live in 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings with their partner in the inner suburbs, and now they add 1.7 kids to the family. They need a Zoom room because all of a sudden we work from home. That means they go to wherever they can afford a 3 or 4 bedroom house. It's not the inner city. The stock isn't available, and the little stock that is available is unaffordable. In middle Australia, in the middle suburbs, there is no housing stock available because the baby boomers that live in those houses as empty nesters, they're not selling, they're not downsizing. The downsizing narrative is a bit over exaggerated in Australia because Aussies only downsize once the family home becomes a physical hazard to be living in, a nuisance to manage. And the baby boomers are still too young and too healthy in the 2030s. So they will only start doing this in the 2030s. So therefore, the millennials had to jump the middle suburbs and they moved to the urban fringe. They moved to regional Australia. And this is a long and roundabout way to answering your question about the unaffordable issues in regional Australia, because all of a sudden you have a couple of millennial families, young families, moving into the regions, and they drive house prices through the roof like crazy, because these are tiny, tiny housing markets. And you throw in a couple of more people, and the existing stock is empty. Oh, it's not empty, it's full. So there's no more vacancies. And so what happens? Well, prices go up, rental costs go up. It's no problem for the inner city new arrivals because they are on inner city salaries. They can afford it. The people who lose out are the renters, therefore probably the poor people of regional Australia, and the young people who wanted to move out and wanted to stay regionally, but why bother doing this if there's no stock available? So this regional issue should sort of fix itself over time as the local governments, catch on, make land available, and as soon as the local developers build enough housing. But that said, those local developers of a relatively small area, they're used to adding a certain low level of stock every year, and they now need to work at triple the rate in a time of a massive skills shortage. So how are they doing this?
Supply.
Exactly. Exactly. And supply shortage, supply costs. So that's difficult, but over time that should play itself out because the market should actually learn where housing is needed. And, governments should be smart enough to rezone and whatever. So that should work itself out in the long run.
Do you think though, Simon, we're going to ultimately, you say that one of the things that will make it cheaper housing is more supply, which absolutely, if we build it in the right places, but there's really a capacity problem. There's only so many houses, apartments, townhouses. We've only got that many developers. There's actually less developers now because a lot of them are, struggling, right? We've got a global talent shortage of all the people who build these things, all the different trades. People can't afford to upgrade their home. We have these conversations pretty much every day. Yeah. I'd love to upgrade, but, to do that jump is so big. I'm going to renovate. We've got a massive backlog of, houses that are getting older that need to get renovated, right? And people are going to renovate them because they need more space, whether it's for home offices or whether it's for more kids, etc. So do you think we're going to be constrained because we're going to have a capacity problem that we're never going to be able to build enough supply to tip the balance, to have too much supply, which will cause prices? Because on the other side, we've got a demographic, which is a demand problem. We've got a very healthy, younger population that, the millennials you sort of spoke about are all getting to this sort of family stage. And we've got a pretty low home ownership rate in that generation that are going to want to buy. I mean, is it worthwhile sort of talking through, how, I guess, internal demographics and how that creates demand for housing, consistently every year, putting migration to the side? We've got a big need for housing over the next, 2-3 decades.
Correct. It's just that simple, because the solution to many of those problems that we face in Australia is importing more workers. All of those new workers and international students will live somewhere, so that means housing construction will continue. I've spoken a lot about in the past about what you just mentioned, Chris, the renovation cycle. We are building relatively low quality housing stock in Australia. That means that we constantly need to overhaul the housing stock. Which is annoying. But right now, this is biting us in the bum, to be quite honest. Because so we eat up construction workers, tradies in the renovation cycle, even though they would better be placed building new stuff. But exactly. I would say there is now a big opportunity for innovation. Are we really doubling down on prefab houses? Because this way we could build houses faster at a higher volume if it's being available. If you can put it, if you can crane it into the right spot, all of those things. So there is market opportunities opening up for these switched on companies that are doing this already, that can scale up, for new entrants. God knows we have the demand there.
Well, another thing that's really slowed down the building, certainly on the eastern seaboard, has been the rain. It's very difficult to build a house and it's pissing down rain unless it's at lock-up stage and you do all the internals. Yeah. So prefab solved a lot of that problem because all the stuff is built in a factory with a roof on it. And what about 3D printed houses? That's, every now and then you read a media story about that. Have you actually seen any evidence of one? Have you seen one?
I've just seen the media stories, the YouTube videos, and I'm always thinking, is this actually the smart way of doing one? I'm completely down with prefab. It makes perfect sense to me. You just build the box and then you have a couple of people doing the internals, easy.
Bolt it together.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the 3D printed house, I don't see the immediate appeal, other than it's interesting kind of like technology, but that's about it.
Do you have any details around sort of, because I think demographics, the more that you sort of learn about it, the more that you find it interesting, the more you get deeper you can go. And I think one of the things that sort of in my picture of, property and, in my mind, what drives prices is demographics. And then, it's the 20-year-old that's going to uni right now that, they maybe in 10 years' time, they meet someone and they save hard in their 20s and then they, want to get a house together, etc. And so, that internal demographics we've got in Australia and, how big that is in terms of a demand in the future. And then also how their migration then consistently tops up that sort of migrate, because we import people that are younger, right? That are sort of pre-housing. How does that all sort of work, I guess?
Well, so if you look at the status quo, that's terribly boring. So let's compare the status quo as of now with a decade ahead. So we do know pretty precisely the Australian population into the future, because usually we dictate how many people will come into the country. And as you mentioned, we know the age of migrants. So that allows us to think about the future. So anything in the population over the age of 50 sees big boom because we're growing old. In percentage terms, the age segment that will grow the most are people in their early to mid 70s over the next decade. That's baby boomers retiring in retirement. So those folks big market. If you can tap into this market, that's probably right around then when they might think about downsizing. Late.
Yeah, but you make it, while we're there though, you make a really interesting point around that, because that's been my observation, is that, I mean, even the government's encouraging this. They don't really want people to go to aged care home. They'll do modifications to their home to keep them in there, whether it's ramps or lifts that are much cheaper than they were in the past.
Yep.
And so, people just want to stay in the home, not for the tax reasons, like their pension and their tax-free growth, and their kids are in their ear to stay at the home because they know that that's a better spot for their inheritance than in their bank account. So, do you find that downsizer thing would really trickle, and it could take a long, long time, because we're living and we're staying healthier than a lot longer than we used to in the past?
Absolutely. I would always think about downsizing at scale happening maybe when you're 80. So I would always look at, just the population in a very simple way. Who is 80 or older? And then how will this segment change over time? And the truth is that the plus 80 market is growing by something like 40% over the next decade. So there will be more downsizing because that kind of demands it. But
well, I guess you've got to sort of look at what are the options for a downsizer. If they're not that appealing, you're not going to sell your house, are you? So it's nursing homes aren't that appealing. Let's face it. Nobody wants to go in one before they have to. And look, I know my mum literally turns 80 2 days after we record this, and Dad's turning 88 soon. They're still alive, and they're still in the home I grew up in.
Yeah.
Despite many efforts to get them out of it, they just haven't. Nothing has seemed to be enticing enough for them to do it. But on the other end of the spectrum, I know a lot that are really proactive with their downsizing. And so as soon as the kids are out of the home, that's it, bang, sold, downsize into an apartment, change their location so they're close to the city where they're going to the theatre more often or whatever it is. They've actually, it's something they've embraced and grabbed with both hands and raced towards. And there seems to be this huge gap between the two groups. Am I making that up, or as a demographer, are you experiencing this?
No, that's certainly true. And you do see here how just lifestyle preferences play into this, because there is this simple idea: we are both retired now. Do we want to change things up? Do we want to enter a new stage of the life cycle? It's the last hurrah, if you will. It's the last chance to sell your house in the middle suburbs of Melbourne, of Brisbane, of Sydney, and then move. We always wanted to live at the sea, whatever. And then you can afford to do so. You do this, you change your lifestyle. Or people are just set in their ways and say, this is where my friends are. My kids aren't living too far away. So why bother? I like it here. And I would say
maybe it's it's that window though, isn't it? It's that window where it's that 65 to 75 where, they've still got the ability to travel and, up and at 'em sort of mentality. We can embrace a change. Maybe both still partners are alive. But, when it gets to that 70, 80s, then it's about safety and being access close to the kids and the grandkids and making those big lifestyle moves, harder to get networks and be out and about and socializing, etc. So, do you see that, if you haven't downsized by a certain age, then your chance of downsizing must drop?
That's the voluntary downsizing then drops. Because you will hear, if you look at a chart that just shows the share of the population with a disability over time, once you reach 80, almost everyone has a disability of sorts.
Yeah.
And then eventually the family home becomes just a nightmare to manage, and you have to get out of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think another stat I saw years ago was I think if your two partners get to 65, there's a 50% chance that one of those would make it to somewhere in the 90s. And so, if you've got a couple at 65, it's, there's 50% chance that, they're going to potentially still live in that house for 30 years. It's not like they're, going to downsize, because even if one dies, then the other one wants to stay there for the emotional reasons, etc. So I don't know. I think it's a really big thing, this downsizing. A lot of people look at the property market and go, all these baby boomers are going to sell out of their houses and buy apartments. And the reality is a lot of them won't, and will just stay in their houses for as long as possible.
Exactly. And that also, if you fast forward into the housing market, let's say the downsizing, because peak baby boomer death will be 2037. So that's 15 years away. So then
It's such an interesting term.
It sounds
Peak baby boomer
Yeah.
death.
Yeah, everything's desensitized in demographer world. It's just death and birth.
exactly. We sometimes call it a peak wealth transfer. That's
Inheritance. I love it.
But so
Peak wealth transfer. Yep.
what you see then is in the mid-30s, you do see people dying off at scale. And this is only looking at baby boomer women, by the way, because they tend to outlive their partners. So then the housing stock of the baby boomers will enter the market at high pace. So that's still over a decade away. So I wouldn't bet on, any kind of massive downsizing, because downsizing in that sense is really cynical, because they downsize to the graveyard, to be quite frank.
Well, that's the ultimate in downsizing, isn't it? But they really don't need much space anymore. But in the meantime, who's to say that when they're they're still, unless they're going to a nursing home, they're still participating in the property market. So they're just freeing up one property to take up another. They're not necessarily freeing up supply. And the other thing too, in terms of my earlier sort of, characterizations of the two types of downsizes, I forgot about the sea change generation. The people that sold up and went to Foster or went down to, the Shoalhaven or whatever. And those sleepy, and often I looked at those coastal towns outside that sort of 2-hour commute to the CBDs as, and you look at the age makeup of those areas is quite, heavily, skewed towards retirees. I imagine those towns have changed quite significant through this COVID migration. So are they as desirable for these these baby boomers anymore?
Yeah. I think that's a nice that's a nice little edge to the question there. So what we've seen during the pandemic is that all of a sudden, young workers with a knowledge job, a laptop-based job, could on the housing market increasingly behave like retirees, meaning they were not shackled to the CBD anymore. They could choose the place of residence based on lifestyle factors. And then more people moved to the beach, more people moved to Southeast Queensland. Essentially, now the Millennials copied the housing behavior of the retirees. Yeah. Which is quite interesting. Of course, also you mentioned the 2-hour extreme commutable distance. Any lifestyle destination within the 2 hours saw massive booms, and outside of this, you saw relatively slower boom, if you will.
Yeah.
If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions, and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
But it's interesting. I've noticed. So we've had a lot of clients that were thinking about doing it pre-COVID, right? They would talk about it and then they go, "Oh no, I can't make it happen. It's too much. With the commute and all our friends." And you'd have to really be fighting the river, right? The salmon going the other way to have done it prior to COVID. But then it completely flipped the other way. If clients were thinking about it, they just went for it. Because it was like that opportunity with work, and if we don't do it now, we never will. But we're actually seeing a second shift now is that actually their parents and their brothers and sisters are following the kids a little bit. It's like before, as the parents would move there and the kids would never go and visit them, and they'd have to always go back to the city to see the kids anyway. But we're seeing the parents just following the kids. Are you noticing any of that sort of second or third waves, I guess, where, friends are following now and family are following because they wanted to sort of see that they were settled there first.
We tried doing this, so we call it tag-along grandparents. We've done this with our old census data, 2016 census data. You can see this, that grandparents follow suit. So it's a real thing, and it makes sense. But it will only happen once the grandparents are both retired.
Yeah.
And so that's the big qualifier here. We see the same with volunteering or child care, child minding data, is that grandparents under the age of 65 do nothing for the kids. in terms of taking care of them, because they're still in the workforce themselves. Once people hit 65, you see this big surge of grandparents looking after their kids, their grandkids, sorry. So that trend is visible. It is quite clear. And I would expect this to be probably a bit, you'd see more of this because simply you have more young people moving to lifestyle destinations. The big qualifier here, though, is that the way that people retire changed over time. Back in the day, on Friday, you got the gold watch and you were congratulated for 40 years of service to the firm. And then it was golf course for decades on end. By now, people slowly slide into retirement. You know, you scale back your hours 3 days per week. Maybe you take 2 months off in the middle of the year to do a Rhine River cruise in Europe. You do all these kind of things. But what this means is that you still have the need to stay connected to the CBD for longer. So you will then not become a tag-along grandparent because you still want to be, I still go to the office occasionally. I still consulting occasionally. So why would I change things? And now you have the big baby boomer generation at a higher percentage in jobs that allow for these kind of lifestyle choices. You know, they are more knowledge workers. They are more office-based than previous generations.
Yeah, but the sort of COVID was more remote work, right? And then that does suit people looking to, a couple of days here, etc. More that outsourcing, contracting becomes much more of a, instead you've got to be in the office 5 days. Do you see that a much more flexible, you hire what you need rather than you just hire a full-time person is going to be the way that we move towards?
That would make sense. So definitely we need more flexibility in all aspects. And that's something that really needs to be branded into everybody's brains these days. That also means you need more flexible systems. One of the reasons why, the stereotypical cliche boss hates the idea of people working remotely is that they have no idea how to manage a remote workforce that is, geographically dispersed, that is in different time zones, that is culturally, generationally more diverse, sexually more diverse. It's crazy. So you need to manage all of this stuff. And there are people out there trying to build systems that allow you to do all of this. All the DAOs, the decentralized organizations, all this Web 3.0 stuff touches on this. They're trying to find new organizational structures. And you need to be flexible because the young people, if they get to work in a way that they prefer at a different company, why the hell would they choose your company? And I think that's just the demands of the workers driving the way that work is offered to the market.
It's sort of interesting, isn't it? This real chicken and the egg, because of course now that, supposedly lockdowns are a thing of the past, unless there's some new really awful, version of COVID. But some organisations are sort of coming out and saying, okay, we want our workforce back in the office, at least for part of the time. And so there might be that sort of pull back to the old ways. I know that it's often been said, and we've often said it, that COVID has really accelerated about 10 years worth of change into sort of a 2-year period. But there will be a pendulum swing back, I would imagine, in some respects. But what you're saying is that the workforce will determine, if we've got a worker shortage, then the workforce will determine how flexible employers need to be. But we don't have that sort of forced situation when we have to work from home any longer. You know what I mean? So I guess could there be a pull that, in two different directions there? So
we want to make sure that work works. That's the first thing that everybody should put on their plate. But if workers want to work from home more than the bosses want them to work from home, that's a problem. That's where conflict is created. And now that you've granted workers the privilege of working from home, you can't take it away. It's called loss aversion. It just means that you are much more likely to hate losing something that was given to you than not being given it in the first place. So now that doesn't work anymore. If you work from home, you will want to continue to work from home in whatever suits your lifestyle and your job. But if you even remove workers and bosses completely and you just look at work, you'd think, why the hell would we come to an office all day long? You would actually want to think at this from the perspective of work. There are certain tasks in your week. Some of those tasks are quiet thinking tasks. You're writing a report, you're programming. This is best done in the peace and quiet of your home, assuming you have a quiet home. And so those tasks are best done at home. And the other parts, the collaborative, the creative parts of your job, they are best done in the office. So why wouldn't you try to structure as much as you can your weeks according to your needs? I'm doing quiet tasks. I'm bunching them into my Monday and Tuesday, and I'm doing Wednesday to Friday in the office, something like this. And it will change from worker to worker. It will look different from week to week because tasks change a lot, and certain kind of roles benefit from being in the office more. And if you take this to the next step, you could actually kill the traditional office, and you just create open collaborative spaces in the CBD. And one case study of a company that has already done this is Dropbox, the online file storage company in Silicon Valley. They killed their offices. They now have a thing they call Dropbox Studios. And you are only, so they're virtual first company, you work from home by default, and you only go into the office to collaborate, to be collaborative, to be creative, to do all those team kind of works. So therefore, the office looks much more, it's like an open kitchen space, lots of little corporation areas, these kind of things.
I mean, it's interesting. I've been very much, this is one of the things I've been always thinking about and tracking what companies are doing what, and asking clients what's happening with your work from home, and getting very mixed conversations actually. I think some companies are really forcing people back to the office. It's really mandated. These are the days you can't, even if you want to work from home on Wednesdays, that's not possible. You're in the office. Very inflexible, and the workers are sometimes just conforming and just saying, okay, well, that's still pretty good. I get 1 or 2 days at home. Some are getting the drop boxes, and even some of the big tech companies just on a phone with a Google today, and some of they have to get back to the office and things like that. And Apple have even come out and said it. So I think maybe we're in this transition though, where the work, even though there's a global talent shortfall, all the companies are figuring out what still works for them, and some are going to shift back to old ways a lot more than the drop boxes of the world. But it's going to take a while for people's confidence to leave the companies that aren't offering enough flexibility, right? Because people don't just all of a sudden get up and quit their job. I know there's this talk of Great Resignation, etc. But I don't really see that. I still feel like everyone's very much sitting on their hands. And people are if they're getting headhunted and offered 50% more salary, they'll go. But a lot of people are still apprehensive to switching jobs if they're not offering flexibility, for example. It's still very early days.
And I think that's a beautiful observation there, is that we in Australia, we are more stubborn, if you will. Why would you, and more loyal, why would you change jobs just willy-nilly? If your job is fine, why would you change it? And plus, there was this thing, we've just been through a pandemic together with your colleagues, with your bosses. And of course, there was JobKeeper, which meant that you actually had a stable income in many jobs. So that means you actually had a good pandemic. So you don't feel resentful against the bosses. So why change then? You want to repay with your loyalty in a sense. I think that's deeply Australian in nature.
It's interesting. I had a client some years ago, this before COVID, and she was telling me how she had quite a senior role, one of the big consulting firms, and they had a desk-free policy or whatever they call it. So everyone was hot desking, and you had a cubicle and a tray or something. But she said that as a new person entering the organisation, she needed to work out who her points of contact were throughout the organisation in order to get things done. It's really difficult to get to know people when you never actually know where they sit. There's no actual area for finance, and there's no sort of particular spot you go to sort of just to find those people. She said it was really, really destabilising. And then she said she reflected on they had sort of lunch and learn type activities and consultations and whatever. And a lot of them are around the mental health impacts of not having a desk. So, but not knowing where you belonged effectively. And she said it's bizarre. They've actually had to go and bring these psychologists in to help people overcome the uncertainty and the instability of not actually knowing where you belonged and where to go. And I wonder whether there's, do people just underestimate how, and that's a bit extreme, but that's probably potentially more like the environments now, post COVID, I don't want to say post-COVID, post-lockdown, where we have this sort of hybrid model where you go and join a new environment, new company. How do you actually start establishing those? How do you knock on the door of somebody's Zoom office? It's like, it would be challenging and stressful.
Well, it already is. So we've seen in the 2 years of the pandemic that the job sector that we could grow the most were highly skilled workers. We grew this market by 12%, which is massive. Skill level 1 jobs,
Wow.
university educated jobs grew by 12% in 2 years, massive increase. But most of those jobs had some element of remote work to them, and it is highly awkward at the very least to onboard people remotely. That's a challenge that, once again, the organizational structures need to actually sort this out over time. And we will sort this out. And there is the idea that you do need to be together occasionally in order to build cohesion within a team. And apparently, so this is research that I read from the US, 1 day per week, the whole team together is enough. So you can actually do it with relatively few points of contact. The thing that worries me is learning in the organization. How do you make sure that the young people, if you're 35 and older, don't worry about it all that much. But in your early years of the career, you really learn a lot from anyone who's older than you. It's simple stuff like, how do I do this thing in Excel? How do I do my timesheet? And these little questions, they are best asked, you just ask whoever sits next to you and they'll answer the question. And so you build little relationships this way, and you don't call somebody for these things. You just then actually read through the instruction manual or whatever.
I reckon technology is going to be a big part. So, for example, with training, some of staff members, we do three-way calls, right? And they just jump on mute in the background. And you can do that with Zoom meetings, right? You could say, look, I'm running this important meeting. You'd get a lot out of it. You can just sit in the background on mute. You don't have to have your video on. And it's a lot less obtrusive, to the person, and they're not sort of sitting there, with their pen writing notes and, et cetera. And so I think, it's maybe solutions like that will be, a great enabler to solve these problems where it's actually technology is a better solution than sitting in on the meeting or going to the coffee and being a bit awkward while you watch your boss negotiate a big transaction, et cetera. So do you think that's going to help, I guess?
It absolutely does help. So the idea, though, here is that you guys were proactive in establishing something like this, and that's what is needed now from the from the employers. You need to think about, what do we actually want? You don't want workers back in the office. That's stupid. What's the actual outcome that you want, and how can you get it? And if you've done it all, and being together is the one thing that's needed, then that's what's needed, and then you can demand it from your workers. That's fine then. But if you just do it because you're too bloody lazy to think about new ways of doing work, then you probably will struggle to find staff in a skill squeeze.
Simon, do you notice any, there's one of the things, people with property, sometimes they say, oh, look, we're not getting wage increases and property's just going up a bigger multiple of income, right? Salaries haven't gone up in 30 years and property's gone up, tenfold, et cetera, right? Those sort of sayings. What are you sort of seeing, though, is, there are people getting salary increases. They're getting promotions. Maybe they're not getting their annual CPI increase, but they're getting salary increases, plus they're getting wage rises and bonuses, et cetera, but it's only a cohort. What portion of the sort of workers are sort of getting most of the benefits when, the typical sort of people are on minimum wages aren't getting it, for example?
It's quite sad. It's the higher up you are, the more likely you are to negotiate a better salary, the more likely you are to actually be, that efforts are being put into retaining you because you are harder to replace by definition. So if you read all those articles that said the virus doesn't discriminate, I always was very pleased reading this, because this sounds like a terribly postmodern virus, who treats everyone the same.
Socialist virus.
But that's really not the case. So we've seen
Yeah.
jobs on the top grow. The further down the skill ladder you go, the more likely you were to lose your job, the more likely you were to be exposed to the virus through your job, the less likely you were to be vaccinated. So you had this massive disadvantage. And so we are further driving Australia apart into rich and poor throughout the pandemic, which is quite dramatic. And it's a catastrophe from a social cohesion perspective.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, social unrest. I mean, you look at basically revolutions around the world over the centuries have all been caused fundamentally because of this massive growing divide between those that have and those that don't. Do you see that if Australia is still on this trajectory that we're at risk of that?
So I wouldn't see any kind of major unrests in our future, but we're moving into the direction of having an economy that looks like South Africa, that looks like Brazil, that looks like America, where we take away jobs from the middle class. So we shrink the middle class and we add high income jobs and we add low income jobs. So that means that the high income earners, the low income earners, they don't have the glue of the middle class. They segregate spatially. So they live in different corners of the city. That means their kids go to different schools. So where do those people meet? You know, they don't go to church anymore, atheist country. So that means, you know, you don't even have the experience of being one under God in the same pew once a week. So you don't have that. That really leaves the biggest, most important social glue in Australia, sports. So you must not underestimate spectator sports, your rugby, your footy, your cricket as an element that both rich and poor workers enjoy and consume. So therefore, I'm also always claiming that the biggest catastrophe that's happening to sports is pay TV, that locks certain groups out of consuming sports. So it takes social glue away. So I'm always happy to see sports on free TV, free to air TV. So that's my little spiel about sports.
Yeah, I mean, football is a religion. As a very sad Liverpool fan this week, who probably should have won the league. But yeah, I'll follow that till I die. But I mean, I guess the another thing that happened this week was the election, right? And as someone who would find these things interesting, what's your sort of observation of, you know, what it really means for Australia? Not so much of what the Labor market, Labor party mean in terms of their policies, etc. But what's sort of the bigger picture that sort of comes out of the results and the independence, etc. And, you know, what does that mean for our future?
So what I see in the election is a continuation of a trend that has been going on since 1990. In 1990, 2% of the votes went to parties other than Labour and Liberal, to the third parties. That number, 1990, 2%. That slowly edged up to 26% bit by bit as of 2019. And now at this election, we hit around 33%. So we turbocharged this trend. So thinking about a two-party system seems a bit ridiculous. If I'm thinking about the Labour Party, you know, the big winner, landslide election win, these kind of headlines, they are technically true because they won the seats, but overall the Labour Party has the lowest result ever. Under a third of all votes go to the Labour Party, so it's a terribly low vote, a terribly low outcome for the Labour Party. So nobody at the Labour Party should congratulate themselves for anything. The Labour Party continues to be at structural risk as they ever were, because if I just said it, the middle class is eroding away. The traditional jobs that were supporting the Labour Party are continued to be taken away from the workforce in Australia. So Labour might well continue to decline even more. And we've seen this in Germany, where Labour was around 40% for a long time, and they're now in some polls they are 12, 13%. So Labour of any party is at the biggest risk of being completely eliminated in the next couple of decades.
That's sort of interesting, because my observation is that you look at the Liberal Party and you certainly look at the balance of Liberals to Nationals now. The Nationals have a greater proportion as their share of that, what do you call it? Coalition.
There's
a word for it. Thank you, coalition. That's exactly the word I'm looking for. So their proportion, that coalition is greater. And so, we're only recording this literally just after the election. We won't go to where until July. So we'll know some of the answers to this stuff, but this is all musing. So I look at the votes or the seats that the Liberal Party lost, which are all the moderate seats, basically, where the Teal candidates went in and knocked out those moderate politicians. Wouldn't you say the Liberal Party is more at risk because they're left with the sort of the right wing part of the party? There's not a lot of moderates left. And then if the Nationals do decide to go even further right, the traditional base of the Liberal Party has got nowhere to go. So is that party at its existential crisis as well?
They're also at a crisis. I don't see them immediately as dramatic as a crisis as the Labour Party, because there are structural things in the Labour Party that don't seem to be fixed. The issue with the Liberal Party is, where the hell do they get their voters from? If the Liberals had been switched on enough, and I think I might have, one of in your podcast said it before, if they learned the most important lesson for any conservative party across the world, to beat the Green movement, to beat the progressive, postmodern, pro-environmentalist movement, you need to out-green the Greens.
And now they're calling Queensland Greensland. Can you believe it?
Yeah. So the traditional Green inner city voter is rich. They are financially speaking, economically speaking, a Liberal voter, but they care about the environment. The Liberal Party has done their utmost to create the independent candidates. They will now, funnily enough, and that's this existential issue there that you're pointing at, Veronica, they will now probably take someone like Dutton as their leader. They will listen more to the national wing of the party. So that means they will move further right. They will move not towards the sustainability movement. So they further lose the young voters. They will further lose seats. They will further increase an independent movement, which I actually quite like. That just means Parliament becomes more messy. It becomes harder to form policy, but that's not a bad thing. It always written about that this is a bad thing. You then actually have more parties into Parliament, and you then need to battle these issues out on an intellectual battlefield, which is rather nice, and that's how a democracy is meant to work in the first place. But that said, where this will lead to in probably a decade or so, if Germany is an example, is that we will have Liberal and Labour Party reigning together. Because they will both shrink away a bit more. They will just have over 50% in 3-4 elections, and then those two parties will govern together. It worked well in Germany. It might well work here. And then you just have a really strong opposition on the right. There'll probably be one big right-wing opposition be forming around Pauline Palmer, if you will. And then you'll have a really strong Green Party on the left, which is further driven left. As long as the Green parties aren't actively reigning the country, as long as they're not actively in power, they will be moving further left. Once they are in power, they need to become more realistic. We've seen this with Green parties all over Europe, and then they will become moderate. They'll move to the center with an environmental touch.
So you don't think that the Liberal Party will say, well, it's all good not being, say, pro-climate change, etc., but then that's what caused us to lose the election. So for the next election, we need to go the opposite, right, and win those votes back. So the conscious capitalism music, you just think that it's so ingrained that, that they can't make those radical shifts over short time frames, and it'll be just a natural sort of deterioration of the two parties and become more messy and split the votes around the
that would be that would be my bet. I think, if I was tasked at saving the Liberal Party, I would say you need to strengthen, your regional vote. That's the Nationals. That's fine. So you need to cater to that, and you need to cater to the concerns. But from an environmental perspective, you need to move very much to a progressive stance. You can still have a progressive climate stance and be conservative. That actually goes together really well. And you must have a right-wing or right of center leader like Dutton. That will hurt you in the long run. And you really must out-green the Greens with climate policy.
Yeah.
And my My approach that I put forward in the column is called the Norwegian approach, where Norway, of course, is a country that has tons of oil that they dig out of the ocean and they sell it. And all the income from their oil they put into the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and this money of this fund is meant to building green technology, is making Norway a carbon neutral, carbon positive country, and there is no reason we couldn't push a Norwegian approach towards mining, towards energy in Australia. The problem, though, here is if I am suggesting this Norwegian approach, mine, drill, baby, drill, mine as much as you can, and use all this money for environmental good, the Greens would fall over backwards. They couldn't believe this. But who could I talk to with this policy? Who would actually bite? A couple of the independent candidates would bite. But that's it. So it's a very small share of government that would find this approach attractive. I think it is the most plausible, middle-of-the-road way of doing things, but there's very little appetite for middle-of-the-road, I assume.
Well, it's quite interesting because the whole campaign, I just thought that Labor, it was often the whole policy-free zone was often accused of being. And I thought after the loss of the 2019 election, I'd be very surprised if Labor came out of the gates with lots of really, scary policies. Let's face it, they don't want to lose another unlosable election. And so I would like to think that perhaps we might see what they're really made of. Maybe we can see some interesting stuff. Who knows? But I'd like to hope that there's a bit more oomph in them now they're actually going to govern the country than now that they're not trying to win government.
Hopefully so, because at the moment things are going terribly for the Labour Party. You need to remember this. They're in a structural decline for 4 or 5 decades, and they're continuing down the same path. They're going to be eliminated as a party sooner or later. They have now the chance of redoing this. We created in Australia where we have so many, they're called skill level 4 and 5 workers, so many people working in the gig economy where they're being paid by the gig, by the kilometer, by the hour. If you capture this market and you say, how do we drag those jobs into the middle class by creating more opportunities in the middle class and by automating as many low-paid, low-income jobs as possible? So automation is your friend. We must remember this. There is no need in keeping any of those low-paid jobs in the market. We want to kill as many of those jobs, the jobs, not the workers, as possible. So if this is the approach that the Labour Party goes, a completely pro-tech, pro-automation, pro-AI party that says we do whatever we can to push those low-income workers into the middle class, that would be the right way. And all the while keep a pro-climate change narrative, because the young people, and also increasingly, as we've seen, the parents of the young people. So it was Gen X parents, the parents of teenagers that were very much impacted by the teenagers. So the big environmental Friday for Futures, Greta Thunberg way of thinking actually fed through the teenage brains into their parents. So there you go. All of a sudden,
my daughter, she's 15. She actually did a speech at school, which was why parents should listen to their kids about environmental matters, right? And that surprised me because I was trying to brainstorm topics for this with her, and she gave up on me and went to her father, and her and her father came up with this as a topic, which is pretty incredible because he doesn't really think too much about this stuff, and I'm so proud. And he said to me, he said he actually got an insight into her politics, and I thought that was fantastic. Like way better than if I got involved. He wouldn't have had any, he wouldn't have had any input. So, or potentially never heard it. She still hasn't told me the speech, by the way. I keep asking her to give it to me. But the other thing I think too, which did come to end, it's gone flown out of my brain. We'll have to edit this bit out.
So I've got something if you want.
Oh, yeah, go for it. There was something else I wanted to ask you.
Simon, obviously we've had the election. The other big thing that happened at a government level last year, which was a bit of a farce because we all did it from home on a Tuesday night, was the census. I'd love to get you on. I know that's your favourite day of the year when that data comes out. When should we sort of get you back on to sort of get some insights into that stuff? Because I think it doesn't come out till June to August this year. But when are you going to have some interesting things to talk about?
Yeah, so 28 June, 10 a.m., that's census.
What do you actually get though? Do you just get the big macro data? Do you get some special access doing what you do, or do you just get what the average punter gets?
No, the good thing is that there is no stupid lockup thing this time around. All you get is data loaded up into the ABS tool called Table Builder, which allows you to combine the census data in whatever way you want. So that's the real big exciting release. And that happens in late June. So, give me a couple of weeks. And after this, and then we really know more about the country. And the beautiful thing why I get excited about the census is that I think many Australians don't understand how awesome the census is. We run a census every 5 years and we ask 65 questions. You can combine those and, cross-tabulate them in endless ways. It's beautiful. The Americans run a census every 10 years and they ask 13 questions. They have so much fewer stuff that they can do with their data. So that's quite wonderful. We are really blessed in Australia with wonderful demographic data. So my job, being a demographer, being a data guy, here is so much easier than it would be in the US or than it would be in Europe, where no country really is holding a real census, where it's all done via surveys, which is beautifully, it's good enough and it's kind of cheap, but you can't cross-tabulate your population data with your workforce data, with your social data. We can do all of this. We know so much about the Australian population. And therefore, of course, this is very self-serving narrative because everybody should listen to my little spiel on these things. But in all seriousness, you can run a business in a much more targeted way in Australia than you can anywhere in Europe or America.
Is that why you moved here?
No,
For our census?
I wish I could be saying that, but I just by coincidence discovered how wonderful your census is after the fact.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's always great to have another chat, and we'll reach out sometime in July just to have another episode with you because that census sounds very exciting to me as well.
You'll have the most excited demographer on the podcast by then.
Yeah,
100%. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a Dumbo.